Good afternoon. You are all very welcome to this London Art Week event, which will focus on the work and career of the fascinating 17th century painter Mary Beale. My name is Christopher Baker and I'm the editor of the Burlington magazine. And this talk has been planned to coincide with the opening of a new Mary Beale exhibition at the Philip Mould Gallery in central London. I'm delighted to be discussing Beale's work today with two experts on her who I'd like to introduce you to. Firstly, Ellie Smith, who is the specialist researcher and exhibition coordinator at Philip Mould's gallery. Ellie is the curator of the new Beale exhibition, and among other projects, she created the important recent show on Sarah Biffin, which many of you may have seen. We're also very pleased indeed to be joined by Dr. Lucy West, who is assistant curator at Dulwich Picture Gallery in London. Lucy has worked at a number of distinguished collections, and she curated last year's Dulwich show, the excellent show that they put on Mary Beale. Okay, I think we should start, please, with some very basic questions, if that's okay. Not everyone listening to this talk will be familiar with Mary Beale. So, Lucy, could you please begin by reminding us when and where she was working, and indeed why her career was so fascinating? Lucy.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you for the kind introduction for both myself and Ellie, and a big thank you to London Art Week for hosting today's webinar, and of course a big congratulations to Ellie and the team at Philip Mould for a stunning exhibition, which I hope everyone will be able to go and see and enjoy in due course. But yes, on to Mary Beale, who is extremely difficult to sum up in the form of a short introduction, but I'm going to give it my best shot. If we could perhaps move to the first slide, that would be fantastic. Great. So, as many of you I'm sure will know, Mary Beale was one of the leading portraitists in 17th century Britain. At the height of Beale's career in the 1670s, she was working 6 days a week, aside from Sundays, to keep up with the great demand that she had. And to give a sense of what that really looked like in real terms, at one moment in May 1677, there were 64 wet, primed canvases stored around the Beales' busy Pall Mall house, which I think is a really lovely kind of visual representation of what that must have felt like. As the exhibition at the Philip Mould Gallery so beautifully shows, Beale's output can be divided into really kind of three sections. These were works which were executed for profit, works which were executed for friends and family, sometimes in kind, sometimes through forms of exchange, and a third section which really were quite experimental works, which functioned for Beale to hone and practice her artistic skills. But on to kind of a potted biography of Mary. She was born Mary Craddock in Barrow, which is near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, which is a place which many of the paintings, or some of the paintings in Ellie's show have come from. She was born in 1633, and at the age of 19, she married Charles Beale, who was an amateur painter, colour maker, and for a time a civil servant as well. And it was a match which would actually prove really productive. In the winter of 1655 to 6, the Beales moved to London, first to Covent Garden in the kind of artist quarter there, and then later on to Hind Court at Fleet Street. After that, they moved to Hampshire to a farmhouse there for 5 years from 1665. These were years during which they, in fact, mostly kind of coincidentally missed the plague and the Great Fire of London, which was extremely lucky. But after that, they, and I should say it was during this time that Mary penned her discourse on friendship, which I think Ellie is going to shed some light on in a second. But perhaps most importantly, after that, Mary Beale established herself in Pall Mall in London from the 1670s. And this was really a move which saw the kind of taking off in earnest of Mary Beale's career. And Ellie shared some really interesting research with me, which I'm sure she will elaborate on in due course, which it's thought that Mary's studio was actually on the site of or very close to the Philip Mould Gallery today. So I couldn't help but begin by just sharing this pair of beautiful pendant portraits, which were in the collection of the West Suffolk Heritage Service. I think for me, they really sum up the essence of Mary Beale's portrait practice. These were executed in the first half of the 1670s, really at the climax of Beale's success, when she'd taken up residence in Pall Mall. On the left, of course, we have Mary Beale herself in this beautiful self-portrait where she's holding the palette. And the drape has literally been pulled back, and we are confronted with her looking assertively out at us, holding her palette and mahl stick and brushes, ready to carry out a portrait for a potential sitter. And then on the right, we have Charles Beale, who is kind of in this placement, lovingly kind of looking over at her, in this beautifully dynamic portrait, which is on show at the Philip Mould Gallery at the moment. And I hope we can have a chance to talk about that beautiful drapery in due course. There's a wonderful quote from Mary Buston's work on the technical side of Beale's painting, in which she writes, and I'm quoting from her here, "Mary's artistic skill was ably balanced by Charles's alchemical investigations," end quote. And though I think their partnership was kind of built really on affection, as the warmth of their writings kind of testify, Charles's profession as a colour maker, so someone who procured, manufactured and sold the pigments for artist paints, this did directly feed into the kind of commercial success and efficiency of Mary's studio. So he specialised in ultramarine, red lake and something called pink, which was actually confusing yellow, and we'll talk a little bit about that in due course. But importantly, there was a real kind of spirit of experimentation, I think, in Mary Beale's studio, and Charles helped with kind of experimenting with the stretching and priming of Mary's canvases, manufacturing and preparing her pigments, as I mentioned, trialling really a quite diverse array of media and supports for Mary to paint on, which are explored in the Philip Mould's gallery exhibition. He also experimented with the drying time of her paints and varnishes, really to help speed up the turnover of the studio. We get the sense that this really was an efficiently run and very busy studio practice. And you might be wondering why we know all of this, and that's because Charles meticulously documented life in Mary Beale's studio in a series of notebooks, which again I think we'll be touching on, two of which still survive today and are extremely valuable resources. So while Mary Beale was really the breadwinner of the family, I think we can sort of conceptualise Charles as a kind of studio manager. There were more people kind of peppered throughout Mary Beale's studio, but I think I will stop there, and we can launch into our discussion, and I'm sure those other figures will come to life in due course. I should say, actually, just to complete the picture, that Mary died in 1699, so right at the end of the 17th century, and she's was buried at St James's Church in Piccadilly, so just round the corner from her Pall Mall studio, and of course steps away from the Philip Mould Gallery as well. So I shall leave that there, and we can hopefully launch into some discussion.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you. That was brilliant. Now perhaps we might move on. Thank you so much for all those comments, to consider your different perspectives on the artist. You both curated exhibitions on Beale with very different titles and different focuses. Ellie, could you start, please, and summarise for us the approach you've taken?
Yeah, I'd love to explain that. I think Lucy and I have come with the same goal, and actually if we could flip to the next slide, I'll give you an idea of some of the goals that we had. The same goal really to progress scholarship on Mary Beale, both in an academic sense, which I hope we've done through catalogue that will accompany the exhibition, but also in a slightly more accessible sense, because so much of what we know about Mary Beale is hidden away in the archives. So many of her work haven't been exhibited before or are tucked away in private collections. So hopefully with this exhibition, we've brought into the public domain a little bit more of what she was about. And we've got very, very lucky, and we're really delighted to have so many loans from so many different places. So we've got a really lovely loan from the Museum of the Home that you can see just on the right-hand side in the middle wall, which is Mary Beale's very first self-portrait with her son and her husband. And we've been delighted to have lots of loans, as Lucy mentioned, from Moyse's Hall Museum, as well as some private collections that have never been seen before, and a number of works which have been recently identified to be by Mary Beale's hand. So we've divided it up into 3 rooms, which kind of reflect the 3 categories that Lucy's just touched upon. So the first room that you can see in front of you predominantly displays works that she would have done for profit. So those are formal commissions in which you would have had a deadline and certain criteria to work towards. So you'll see lots of formal poses and lots of beautiful drapery, and individuals who are wanting to present themselves in a very fashionable light. And peppered throughout these, you'll also see a couple of portraits which are done, as Lucy touched upon, for kindness and in exchange with friends. So you'll see a couple of Beale's outer circle of friends peppered throughout this room, but predominantly quite formal portraiture. And if we flip to the next slide, thank you very much. We've tried to contrast that in the next room along with portraits of her family and her very close circle of friends, in which she suddenly becomes much more experimental. So in the previous room, she's using her finest linen, the finest paints that she has accessible to her. And in this room, you see her using all kinds of materials. For example, she uses a material called bed ticking, which was the material you'd stretch over a mattress before you slept on it, and onion sacking, obviously connotations that are obvious. And she's also using much more experimental poses. So she's twisting her subjects around. You'll see the portrait on the top right there is a beautiful portrait of her husband, who she painted so frequently throughout her career in different guises. And we're lucky enough to have at least 4 portraits of him in the exhibition. So we've tried to give a little taste of each category of work that she was working in, and end with a little section on the Pall Mall studio, which we'll touch on later. But in this room, we hope to give an idea of the technical ways in which she was working, how the studio was run and who was involved and how long she spent in the studio, which I think probably lead us on actually to Lucy's exhibition, which was much more about the technical analysis behind the painting. So Lucy, maybe you want to talk about your exhibition.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Yes, so casting my mind back to last year when we had our Mary Beale display, which was called Mary Beale Experimental Secrets. And as Ellie mentioned, it was very much a chance for us to explore the workings of Mary Beale's studio, this highly efficient workplace, very well organized, very busy, but also a place, as I mentioned in the introduction, in which experimental practices really thrived and became one of the bedrocks on which her studio practice was really founded upon. As Ellie mentioned, we had one particular work in our collection, which we will look at in due course, which we were very fortunate to be able to conserve and also conduct some technical analysis on. So I will talk a little bit about that later, but perhaps if we could move to the next slide. That's great, thank you. So this gives you a little flavour of what the display looked like. And I should say that the title, Experimental Secrets, was taken from a very interesting text which was written, or treatise, which was written by Charles Beale, a kind of a sort of additive document, really, which was begun in 1647 and ended in 1663, and kind of recorded all sorts of experiments and musings on painting, which Charles Beale had worked through. But right at the end of that document, which is entitled Experimental Secrets Found Out in the Way of Painting, right at the end of that document is a very short, what we might call a treatise, which is called Observations by M.B., which has sparked much debate. But it's thought really that this might be by Mary Beale, or not necessarily in her hand, but recording experiments carried out by Mary Beale while she was painting a still life, and specifically a still life painting of apricots. And it's a really wonderful kind of window into this experimentation. And in particular, this treatise highlights a type of ochre called berry ochre. So from Bury St Edmunds, near where she was born. And the text sort of talks about how this particular type of ochre makes the apricots feel so much more soft and lifelike than previous attempts at representing this subject. So that was really where the title for the exhibition came from, and kind of inspired this interest that we had in really kind of exploring these experiments a little bit further. So I'll leave that there, because I think we will kind of move on to talk about what we found in the course of the exhibition.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. So can we now move on to be a little bit more specific and focus on examples of her work? I think you've selected a number of highlights, and it would be great if you could talk us through them. Ellie first, please.
Yes, I'll start, as I think this is my slide. Although the next few slides will have some overlaps, I think. So what's been so fascinating about Mary Beale, and again, Lucy touched on this in her introduction, is just how much we know about her. She really is an incredibly well-documented artist, which is very rare period. Mostly thanks to these extremely detailed notebooks. You'll be able to see Charles Beale's notebook on the left. And her husband recorded not only the kind of daily goings on of the studio, who was coming and visiting and who was popping in for lunch, but more importantly for us, really the exact details of what she was working on, of any painting she was working on at any one time. So there are these beautifully meticulous notes that describe my dearest heart, which the phrase he uses to refer to her. My dearest heart started my portrait today, and then we'll list the number of sittings they did. And this obviously lists sort of the sitters that came through her studio as well. So it's a fascinating resource. And we found quite a few instances in the exhibition where we've been able to pair up the notebooks with exact portraits. If you flip to the next slide, I can give you an example. Thank you very much. This was a brilliant find. So we found in the back of her, of Charles Beale's notebook, a list of payments to her son, Charles, who we know assisted her in her studio later in his life. Both of her sons, Bartholomew and Charles, worked at the studio. And we can see a list of payments on the right-hand side made to Charles Beale. If you look down that list, nifty highlighted for you two sections where it says Mr. Trumbull's 2 ovals, which relate to portraits on the left. So there was brilliant documentation, and it allows us not only to know who was working, but on what exactly, which is excellent for the connoisseurship surrounding Mary Beale, because it allows us to attribute certain aspects of painting to her, such as faces in this one and the oval to her son. So it means we can really kind of progress forward in terms of what we know about her. But predominantly what we know about her really is through what her husband wrote. And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to go back a slide. My next point. Thank you very much. Yes, majority of what we know about her is through what the men in her life wrote, so her husband or her male friends. But we've spent a lot of time reading her Discourse on Friendship, which was written in 1666. And it's this utterly beautiful letter that she wrote to a female friend, in which she kind of spills all of the beans on her thoughts on friendship and on equality, particularly equality between husband and wife. So this has been an extremely valuable resource, because it's a rare insight into what she thought and her own thoughts, as opposed to the sort skewed through someone else in her life. And it's from this that we lifted the title of our exhibition, Roots of Friendship. And it felt very appropriate to use her voice and to use her words as the title of the exhibition, as I know, Lucy, you did the Dulwich Picture Show as well.
Yes, absolutely. We're so lucky, Ellie, as you say, to have so many written resources that we can draw from. And yes, the discourse on friendship in particular, hearing that sort of glimpse into Mary's voice. Am I cutting across you there, Ellie? Shall I talk a little bit about? Yes, great. Well, if we could just roll through a couple of slides, I think. Possibly the next one. Great. Yes. So as I mentioned, as well as the importance of looking at documents like the notebooks or like the discourse on friendship or the observations by NB, which I referred to just now. We were very interested in our show at what we could glean from Mary's portraits themselves in terms of what they tell us about the way her studio functioned. So this is one particular portrait that proved very important in the course of our show, which, as I said, we were very fortunate to be able to conserve it and conduct technical analysis at the Curatorial Institute of Art. So this on the left is a portrait of a young man, which is in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection. It entered the collection in the 19th century through the art dealer and collector Charles Fairfax Murray. But it's part of a group of portraits which were once thought to depict the poet Abraham Cowley. And this group of portraits includes another which is in the Philip Mould Gallery exhibition, which is this one on the right-hand side. Another portrait of a young man. Today, people tend to think that they might depict Bartholomew Beale, who was Mary Beale's eldest son. But I tend, in the case of our portrait, I tend to kind of move away from that a little and focus more on, as I say, what this portrait can actually tell us about Mary Beale's studio practice. Something that was really interesting in the course of the conservation treatment that was carried out on this painting was what was revealed about the ways in which the face and the drapery had been painted. So originally, before the portrait was conserved, it was obscured with this very grey, kind of quite stubborn varnish, which when removed really revealed the subtleties of Mary's technique. So in particular, I mean, even in this reproduction, but especially when you see it in the flesh, it's so striking actually how finely detailed the faces of many of Mary Beale's sitters are. In this case, I'm really struck by the kind of luscious curly locks, that kind of plump Cupid's bow mouth, which is so characteristic of many of Mary Beale's sitters, the kind of 5 o'clock shadow. But something that was revealed to us after the cleaning was this tiny little red birthmark which appears under the sitter's right eye, so the left eye as you look at the portrait. And I think this is really evocative of or indicative, I should say, of Mary Beale's approach to her sitters. She often had a very kind of literally warts and all approach to depicting the faces of her sitters, and you'll find that as you go through the Philip Mould Gallery exhibition as well, all these kind of little details that kind of come to life the more closely you look at her portraits. So clearly, you know, Mary Beale was the person who was executing the really important parts of the composition, like the faces, but we were really struck in comparison by the depiction of the drapery in this portrait, which is, as you'll find in quite a few of Mary Beale's portraits, very, sometimes quite mechanically executed, but very broadly and quickly executed. And Ellie, you alluded to the fact that actually often Mary Beale's studio assistants and her sons, Charles Jr. and Bartholomew Beale, were executing things like drapery and these kind of fictive framing devices in the studio. So I think we were very interested in how you could, even before doing kind of technical analysis or reading the notebooks, you can tell actually from looking at these portraits, you know, actually how these were kind of carried out in the space of the studio. Could we just flick on to the next slide very quickly? Lovely, thank you. I should also say that in the context of the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection, Mary Beale is actually the only historic female artist in the collection. And as such, we have to be quite creative when thinking about how we explore Mary Beale as a figure in our collection. And a way that we did this was look at her agency beyond being an artist. She was also a collector as well. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I just wanted to flag another painting that was in our exhibition, which was this one on the left, which is by Peter Lely. It's a portrait of Bartholomew Beale, so Mary Beale's eldest son. And very interestingly, in the 1670s, perhaps we can talk about this in a bit more detail in due course. Mary Beale and Charles Beale and her children would go to the studio of Peter Lely to watch him at work, so that Mary Beale could take along her notebook, make lots of notes, and really watch the kind of secrets of the artistic process in the space of the studio. We think that this painting on the left by Lely of Bartholomew Beale was actually commissioned by Mary and Charles Beale in order that Mary could then go and watch this painting be made. And then after the painting was completed, it then hung on the walls of Mary Beale's house. I've just included this red chalk drawing on the right-hand side, which is attributed to Charles Beale Jr., so Mary Beale's youngest son, in the British Museum. It's part of a really beautiful corpus of red chalk drawings there. But as you can see, it's really a copy of the face of the Lely portrait in our collection. And so I can't help but wonder if, Charles Jr. Beale was kind of looking at this portrait on the walls of Mary Beale's home. So I just wanted to flag that, really, just to show how, in having to be quite creative in the context of the museum, it actually enabled us to think about Mary Beale's agency in different ways beyond her role as artist, but also as collector, and giving us the opportunity to think about actually what was on the walls of her home as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lucy, very much indeed. Thank you, Ellie, once again. Everything you said seems to reveal a great deal about Beale's studio practice and the issue of how she navigated being a woman artist in the 17th century. I'd be really grateful if you could both please expand upon this issue, because I know you've had fascinating conversations about it. Ellie, please.
Yes, certainly. It's definitely something that I personally find absolutely fascinating about Mary Beale, is just how she managed to navigate this extraordinary art world as a woman when there definitely were women working. At the time, there were other women artists, but to the extent to which she was so prolific is totally rare for the period. And I think at its foundation is definitely a collaborative relationship between her and her husband. His support would have utterly aided her ability to be able to go on and be the successful artist we know her to be today. It would have been equally rare for the period for a woman to put herself forward as the figurehead of a family, which she was during the time she was running her professional studio. And equally, if you think about a man at that period stepping back and kind of taking off that layer of masculinity and letting the wife be the breadwinner is totally unconventional for the period. It's something I find so fascinating about Beale. And the fact that she was a family woman, she had 2 children, so she was an artist mother, at a time when women were definitely judged on their virtue and their piety, their respectability, almost helped her further. So she, in her family portrait, which I think we'll look at a little bit later. In fact, why not? Let's look at it now, actually. Could we just pop to I think it's the last slide. Sorry for all the clicking. This is it. Brilliant. In this very early family portrait, you see her depicting her husband, Charles, and her son, Bartholomew, in this kind of gorgeously harmonized family unit. But she's very defiantly gesturing to herself. It's her husband that's holding the son. And you can see his hand gently placed on his shoulder and cupping his palm. While Mary separated herself ever so slightly, you can see that the dark shadow cast by the drapery and she's just distanced herself ever so slightly from the two men. This pose as well, the gesturing toward herself is very kind of Van Dykean, and then at the twist looking over the shoulder, you can tell that she's looking at tropes in male portraiture. So she's constantly having to balance all these different hats as a woman. She's an artist, which needs to remind you that she's a respectable artist for the family. So she's jumping through all these hoops that her male peers, quite frankly, don't have to jump through, or other hoops they're having to jump through. So I have so much respect for her in that sense, that she's having to navigate so many different obstacles. Sorry, I'm just starting to end out to remind me of my next point. But her integration of her home and her family studio, her family home and her studio, I think also helped give her a layer of respectability as well. Her studio was actually placed within the family home when they moved to Pall Mall. So sitters would be greeted at the door, they'd be walked up through the house to the studio. So you have a kind of very domestic setting in which people are working. And so for men visiting her studio in particular, being left alone with a woman at this time, she didn't raise eyebrows. Being in this domestic setting with her husband and with her stepchildren kind of in the background would have helped aid her status as a woman of virtue.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ellie. You paint a very compelling picture about respectability and decorum, I think, actually. Perhaps that's the appropriate word for the period. And Lucy, do you want to expand on that as well? Because it seems to be a key theme for our understanding of Mary Beale's achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing, sort of thinking about how her success was kind of manageable. Ellie has touched on so many important points there. I think something that is very, very striking is the efficiency of her workshop. She was a very, very savvy business person, as well as a very, very skilled artist. And I think it was that efficiency and business know-how and acumen that really made her quite fast-paced and very, very busy studio possible. Perhaps if we could go back a couple of slides. Yeah, perfect. I think a key way that she was able to manage her studio in this highly efficient way was through having her artistic materials, her supports, her pigments, the latest know-how in how to dry your varnishes in the quickest time, how to get your pigments to dry so that you could work on the next part of the painting. Having that on her doorstep through the work of Charles Beale, I think was really, really important. And that was something that really came out in the course of research for our display at Dulwich last year, and in particular through the technical analysis that we had done on the portrait of a young man, which I showed you earlier. I show you here on the easel in the conservation studio. And as I said, we were able to have different elements of technical analysis carried out at the Curatorial Institute of Art, which we were very grateful for. One of the really interesting things that we managed to find was, we were very interested in the fact that Charles Beale would, for example, prime and stretch Mary's canvases in preparation for her to work on them. Yet another example of this kind of very, very efficient studio practice. Everything was kind of ready and waiting for Mary Beale to work on. And we were really interested to find in the samples that were taken from our painting in the course of technical analysis that actually the priming layer in our canvas was absolutely what you would expect to find in a canvas primed by Charles Beale. He writes at great length in his notebooks of his recipes for priming canvases. He used a very particular combination of lead white with these kind of organic earth pigments suspended in them, and that's exactly what we found in the priming layer from our canvas. So a really nice example of how Mary Beale, in this case, was capitalising upon a canvas, that had been ready and primed by Charles Beale for her. As I mentioned, I think surely the fact that she had the best pigments at her disposal was really important in enabling her success, and really, putting her at this kind of high level. I showed the self-portrait right at the beginning, with that palette that she is holding so conspicuously. That's not an accident. She has portrayed herself in that way to really show off the quality of her pigments. And there's some really lovely examples in the show at the Philip Mould Gallery, and I'm sure Ellie can elaborate much more eloquently than I can on this portrait. But I just wanted to pick out this portrait of Anne Sotheby, which has this beautiful sweep of blue fabric, which kind of sweeps under her right arm and really takes up a very significant amount of the picture plane. Ellie, am I right in thinking that there is ultramarine in this piece of fabric?
Yeah, absolutely correct. And we know she charged an extra £1 for the use of ultramarine in these portraits.
Absolutely, which again, it's really showing her kind of business savvy in charging the extra for ultramarine. She also Charles Beale was also known for his red lake, which also appears in her portraits. For example, we found a significant use of red lake in our portrait. Unfortunately, there's no ultramarine. The eyes in our portrait, which look blue, are actually an optical illusion of black and white. So I can't boast that we've got ultramarine in our painting, but this portrait of Anne Sotheby is a really beautiful example of that conspicuous use.
It is wonderful, isn't it? It's one of the great stars, I think, of the Philip Mould exhibition. Well worth seeing, actually.
Finally, I'd be very grateful if you could both say something about Beale's critical fortunes. She's clearly being very seriously assessed now through both of your projects, but how has her reputation developed up to this point?
I think, Lucy, shall I go first with that?
That sounds great, and I'll pitch in afterwards.
Well, I think that Beale's trajectory has been building and building and building. Tabitha Barber, the curator at the Tate, has done some absolutely incredible work on her and a career's worth of research. And their upcoming show at the Tate is going to be extraordinary, and I think will include Beale. So scholars like Tabitha Barber have really set an incredible record. And Dr. Helen Draper as well, I know, is doing amazing research on Mary Beale, and has written a brilliant thesis, which she's also contributed to our exhibition as well. So there are lots of brilliant researchers working on her at the moment. So I think really the only way is up with Beale. We know even from our exhibition, from doing the research that we have with this, just how much more there is to learn. And actually Anne Sotheby, who's on the screen now, is a really good example of just how much more we have learned over the course of this exhibition. This is a very rare portrait that we know for sure that Charles, her son, painted the drapery of. So it's just slowly building our understanding of how her studio worked, who was working in it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, what we can surely attribute as Beale. So we know in this she did the face, and that Charles was paid for doing the drapery. So we're constantly kind of pushing the subject forward. And I think the more exhibitions and the more research done, it's becoming clear that there is so much more to learn about her. I think in the past she suffered slightly from being described as a kind of follower of Lely, or someone who works in his manner, but she's most certainly an artist in her own right, and has an enormous output of paintings to prove that, along with all of the documentation that's hidden away in the archive. So I think I'm very excited about the movement forward with Beale and what we might be able to see next.
Great, yeah. Thank you. Lucy, could you give us your thoughts on those really important points, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate Ellie's point, I think, your exhibition, Ellie, at the Philip Mould Gallery is so important in growing what we know of the corpus of Mary Beale. It's just such a rare opportunity to see so many works by Mary Beale all in one room. And, it's only really when you see works in the flesh side by side that you can start filling in the gaps and working out who did what and attributions. So I think, it's such an exciting opportunity, which, as you say, I hope is just the beginning of lots of really exciting things to come. Just thinking about sort of Mary Beale's historic kind of critical fortune. Ellie, you might also have some kind of further thoughts on this, but I think it is striking that Mary Beale was written about in her own time. She featured in several essays. She had poems dedicated to her, and strikingly, in the 18th century, so the century after her death, George Virtue, an antiquarian and art historian, transcribed and published many of Charles Beale's notebooks. So she clearly has had this kind of steady. She's never been fully lost from kind of public consciousness, and has had this kind of steady kind of awareness of her. Something that was really interesting in thinking about her critical fortune in the context of the Dulwich show was a question around a signature that we found on our portrait of a young man. I don't know if we can just go back a slide or two. I can't quite remember where maybe back another one. Yes, it's very difficult to see in this reproduction, but we found in the left-hand spandrel, bottom left-hand spandrel of this fictive kind of oval framing device in our painting, there was a little signature, Mary Beale, which was clearly a later addition, probably a 19th century addition to the portrait. We know that the canvas was relined in the 19th century, and I wonder whether this is when this little signature was put in. We had really interesting discussions with our conservator about whether or not in the course of conservation treatment we should keep this signature, or whether it should in fact be removed to return the painting to its more kind of original state. We took the decision to keep the signature because we actually thought, well, this is a really interesting insight into the critical fortune of Mary Beale. And in fact, someone, perhaps Charles Fairfax Murray, who was the collector and dealer who owned this painting in the 18th and 19th century, early 19th century, perhaps actually the fact that this signature was added is really important. It shows that whoever owned this portrait and put this signature on it really valued the fact it was by Mary Beale. And so I think, that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind in its own right. So I just wanted to kind of add that in, just because I think, it's easy to sort of think about the bigger picture, but actually to the person that owned this portrait, the fact it was by Mary Beale was really significant.
Okay, thank you again. We do have time for a few questions. We certainly received a lot, and I think we'll be able to address one or two if that's okay. Firstly, fascinating question. Are there drawings that have survived by Mary Beale, please? If you could both comment on that, that would be great.
Ellie, I wonder whether it would be interesting in relation to that question to talk a little bit about the works on paper which were adhered to canvas in your exhibition. Yeah. I wonder if that might be an interesting jumping off point.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've got an example somewhere. I can't remember where it is on this slide.
Oh, yes.
Do you have one? No, next. Sorry. Bear with us, everyone.
Maybe it's the other direction.
I'll talk while we find it. There are some really, really beautiful oil sketches that Mary Beale did of her son Bartholomew. Brilliant. There it is. You can see one on the left. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. Perfect. In fact, you can see two examples here. You can see Mary Beale's self-portrait, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, and she's got her hand on a canvas which has got two head studies, both of her children, and you can see on the left another head study of her son Bartholomew. And she did. There are around 12 known surviving works of Bartholomew painted in this manner. Most of them are just head studies. This has actually got a later edition of the costume that was added at a later date. They are beautiful, beautiful drawings of a mother painting her son. with a lot of understanding, a lot of sympathy, I'm sure, for how a child would sit or not sit for a portrait. But these very experimental and very early works, I think, are indicative of her incredibly early talent and ambitions to succeed as an artist in a professional capacity. They were done on paper, which again is would make sense given the date, because they're incredibly early. She probably didn't want to commit to painting on canvas, which was much more expensive, but is also why we've lost so many of the works. So the works that do survive, and is the case with the work on the left, is that it was painted on paper and then later laid on canvas. And actually the example on the left is stretched onto a 17th century stretcher, making us think that it was probably almost certainly stretched in Beale's lifetime, perhaps even by Charles Beale, her husband himself. So in terms of drawings, no, but in terms of these oil sketches on paper, we've got some really lovely examples.
Could I just jump in as well? Thank you, Ellie. That was really, really fascinating. And just to jump in on not quite on the subject of drawing, but on the subject of underdrawing, which are the preparatory kind of layers of drawing that you might find under the paint layers in a finished painting. Something that struck us about our portrait of a young man in the Dulwich collection was that actually there was very limited underdrawing in the portrait, and actually it strikes me that in looking at this the portrait of Mary Beale in the National Portrait Gallery, I mean, from looking at what we can see of the canvas that Mary Beale is holding, again there's this sense that actually that there is no underdrawing here. These figures are kind of appearing out of the blankness of the canvas, and I think there's something there about the kind of almost the secrecy of the artist's working method. And this was a time in which there were many kind of treaties and texts being published on how to paint and how to create colour, but also the kind of a fascination with the secrets of the artist's trade. And we can think back to Charles Beale's own treatise called Experimental Secrets. So I wonder if there's something there, just looking at this Mary Beale self-portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, of her kind of playing with us slightly and hiding that kind of preparatory process in displaying this canvas in that way. I just thought I would sort of muse on that on the subject of drawing and kind of preparation.
Thank you so much. You've taken the question of drawing off in so many different directions. It's really intriguing. I think in so many ways the works we've been looking at show Beale drawing with paint, if I may put it like that, capturing the character in particular of her own family. She was evidently an extraordinarily knowledgeable and interested and interesting artist, aware of contemporary art, earlier art, especially the work of Van Dyck. And indeed she had her own collection, as you touched on earlier. The flip side of this is, did she have a wider reputation beyond London? What of Europe? Was she known about in Europe during her life and perhaps a little later?
Gosh, I don't know about you, Ellie. I'm not so sure on that question. As you say, Christopher, she certainly had a very interesting collection at home. She would have works by Anthony van Dyck, Peter Lely on her walls. These artists that are so important, of course, in the Dutch tradition. I mean, I don't know whether you can shed more light on this, Ellie. There are very interesting. Charles Beale was very interested in kind of Italian culture. He certainly owned texts, treaties by Leonardo da Vinci, for example, Italian sort of contemporary Italian texts on painting. I think he may have even tried to introduce Mary Beale to the Grand Duke of Tuscany when he visited London, to no avail. That meeting didn't happen. But I don't know whether do you know any more, Ellie, about the Beale's reputation abroad?
I wonder if this links to what we were talking about earlier so slightly, is how confounded we are by this. I will refer to Barbara the expert for more knowledge, but I think the fact that she was a woman artist meant she had to be a little less brazen in her advertising. And we see that play out in her portraiture. So in the way that Lily, as a court painter, would immediately have had an international audience, Mary Beale had to be slightly more nuanced to retain that layer of respectability as a woman. She wasn't able to go out and be as brazen as her male peers. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons as to why she doesn't have such a prolific status outside of Europe, because she's constantly building connections with friends, and it's kind of through word of mouth that she's acquiring patronage, and it isn't as kind of out there. And I think it's probably to do with her status as a woman in a period in which women weren't supposed to be earning a living.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a terrific observation, and very neatly and cleverly, I think, brings us back to one of the key themes that we've had running through this whole discussion. I'm going to sadly draw it to a close now, and thank you both for your insight and your expertise and your eloquence, and indeed your passion for Mary Beale's work. I would encourage everyone, and I know there's been about 150 people listening into this talk, to go and see the terrific new exhibition on her at the Philip Mould Gallery in London. And finally, I'd like to thank the London Art Week for hosting this fascinating discussion. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.